autumn of 1969, on a gravel road outside of Vermilion, Alberta, a 38-year-old woman named Marion Selkirk walked into the Vermilion Agricultural Office and asked to speak with someone about cover crops. The clerk at the front desk, a young man fresh out of Lakeland College, who had been filing soil reports since June, looked up from his desk and asked her to repeat herself. Cover crops, Marion said, specifically, which legumes overwinter best in Peace River clay. The clerk found her a pamphlet from 1954 and told her he would have someone call her the following week. Nobody called. Marion drove home through a landscape that was turning the color of old burlap. The fields on either side of secondary Highway 41, stripped bare and harrowed flat the way every farmer in Vermilion County had been doing since before the war. She had driven that road 1,000 times. She knew every farmstead by its windbreak. She knew which families had been there since the homestead era and which ones had come in after 1945. She knew the land the way you know a person you have lived beside your whole life. Not perfectly, not without surprises, but deeply and without having to think about it. What she was thinking about on that drive was red clover. That is where this story starts. Not with a drought, not with a crisis, not with a moment of visible triumph. It starts with a woman. It's a woman driving home from a government office with a pamphlet she had already read, thinking about a plant most of her neighbors considered a weed. Let me tell you about Marion Selkirk, because what she did on her family's farm over the next 16 years is one of those stories that only makes sense once you understand who she was and what she had been paying attention to. Marion was born in 1931 on the same quarter section her grandfather, a Scottish immigrant named Alistair Drummond, had broken in 1907 with a borrowed horse and a borrowed plow. Her father, Robert Drummond, had farmed that land through the Depression and the dry years and the grasshopper years, and he had come out the other side intact, which was not something every family in Vermilion County could say. Robert was not a spectacular farmer. He was a careful one. He kept records. He never put more acres into grain than he had the hands and equipment to harvest without panic. He left headlands unharvested when the weather turned, which his neighbors thought was waste, and which Robert thought was insurance. He did not explain himself very often, but when he did, he spoke about the land as though it had opinions worth knowing. Marion absorbed this without knowing she was absorbing it. She married in 1953. Her husband, a quiet man from Lloydminster named Gordon Selkirk, was a decent farmer and a genuinely kind person, and he died in March of 1963 of a heart attack while unloading a truck in the yard, 2 days after his 41st birthday. He left Marion with 480 acres, a grain operation with modest debt, 2 daughters in school, and a foreman named Walt Penner, who had worked for the Drummond family for 11 years and had, in that time, developed a loyalty to the land that came close to matching Marion's own. Marion did not sell. Her mother-in-law suggested it. Her bank manager, a careful man named Hugh, who was not unkind but who did not fully understand what he was looking at, suggested she consider her options. Marion told Hugh she would think about it. Then she went home and told Walt that they were going to plant barley in the south field, and she had some ideas about the rotation she wanted to discuss before spring. That was 1963. By 1969, the year she walked into the agricultural office with her question about legumes, Marion had paid down the debt her husband had left, expanded the operation by 120 acres through the purchase of an adjacent quarter from an estate sale, and come to a conclusion that she did not discuss with anyone except Walt. And In her weekly letters, with an agronomist in Guelph named Dr. Sylvia Morrow, whom she had never met in person, but with whom she had been corresponding since 1965. The conclusion was this: the land around Vermilion was being farmed to death in slow motion, and almost nobody could see it. Not through carelessness, not through greed, exactly. Through habit. Through a system of serial monoculture that had been standard practice since the 1920s and had been reinforced by every agricultural policy, every equipment manufacturer, every elevator company, and every neighbor's example for 50 years. Plant wheat or barley, harvest. Fallow every 3 years, plant again. The system worked. It produced grain. It paid bills. It had kept families on the land through hard times. It was also, Marion had come to believe, stripping the soil of something that could not be replaced through a bag of commercial fertilizer. Organic matter, biological activity, the slow, patient capacity of ground to hold moisture through a dry July, to warm up faster in a cold April, to recover from a bad year without 3 years of chemical amendment. The land around Vermilion was not dying. It was diminishing, quietly, one harvest at a time, the way a person diminishes when they never quite sleep enough. Marion had not arrived at this conclusion through intuition. She had arrived at it through reading. She subscribed to 3 agricultural journals and had convinced the Vermilion Public Library to order a 4th. She had been corresponding with Dr. Morrow for 4 years about nitrogen fixation and soil biology. She had read everything published in English about the Dust Bowl prevention work done in Saskatchewan in the 1940s, and had written several letters to the Soil Conservation Council of Canada that had received polite, non-committal responses. She had, on her own initiative, started pulling soil samples from her fields in 1966 and paying a private laboratory in Edmonton to test them for microbial activity, as well as chemical composition, which was not something any laboratory in Vermilion County offered, and was not something any of her neighbors had thought to do. What the samples showed, year by year, was not dramatic. It was a trend. Her fields were holding their organic matter better than the county average. Not dramatically better. Better in the way that a person who walks an extra mile every day is better off after 10 years than one who does not. The difference invisible on any given Tuesday, unmistakable over a decade. The reason, she believed, was a practice she had started in 1964, the year after Gordon died, almost by accident. She had seeded red clover into the barley on the south field that spring, intending it as a forage crop for hay, as farmers had done before the war. She had done it because she had a bag of clover seed her father had left in the bin room, and because she was short-handed and could not manage a dedicated hay operation that year, and because the south field had been in continuous cereal for 6 years, and something in her, some instinct she had not yet named, told her it needed a rest. The clover germinated under the barley canopy. The barley came off in August. Marion did not harvest the clover. She left it standing through September and into October, then rolled it down in November before freeze-up and turned it in with the disc. The following spring, the south field went into wheat. The wheat on the south field that year was the best she had grown since Gordon died. She did not tell anyone. She noted it in her records, and she wrote to Dr. Morrow about it, and Dr. Morrow wrote back 8 pages about legume nitrogen and soil organic matter and mycorrhizal networks, and suggested 3 papers Marion should try to find, 2 of which the University of Alberta Library eventually sent her on interlibrary loan. By 1969, Marion had underseeded clover into her barley every second year on every field she owned. She had started leaving field margins unharvested in a strip 20 feet wide along the north edges, which her neighbor to the north, a practical man named Art Bergstrom, had pointed out to her at the co-op one spring with the tactful but unmistakable implication that she was leaving money on the table. Marion had thanked Art for the observation and said nothing further. She had also started something that nobody in Vermilion County had a name for yet. She was not fallowing. She had stopped fallowing entirely. In a region where summer fallow was as standard as breakfast, where the bare brown quarter section was as familiar a sight as the grain elevator, Marion Selkirk had quietly replaced her fallow years with cover crop years. Oats mixed with hairy vetch or brown mustard, or the red clover that had started it all. And she was not harvesting those crops. She was rolling them and incorporating them, feeding them back to the ground. Walt Penner did not argue with this. Walt had a farmer's practical skepticism and a good foreman's discipline, and his discipline told him that Marion Selkirk had been right more often than she had been wrong, and that the times she had been wrong, she had caught the mistake before it cost them badly. He did not understand the soil biology she talked about. He understood that her fields went into spring in better shape than his cousin's fields 3 miles north, and his cousin had been farming for 30 years. The county understood less than Walt did. By 1971, the story was moving around. Marion Selkirk is not fallowing. Marion Selkirk is growing crops she does not harvest. Marion Selkirk paid an Edmonton laboratory $62 last year to test her dirt. The story traveled from the co-op to the implement dealer to the coffee table at the Vermilion Hotel on Thursday mornings, where the men who ran the largest operations in the county talked about weather and prices and each other. At every stop, the story got a little funnier. Because Marion Selkirk was not a newcomer. She was not an outsider who could be dismissed as someone who did not understand the country. She was a Drummond. Her grandfather had broken that land. Her father had held it through years that broke other people. She was not eccentric or impractical or difficult. She was, by every visible measure, a good farmer running a profitable operation. And she was doing something that looked, from the outside, like throwing money away in the dirt. One afternoon in the spring of 1972, her neighbor to the east, a third-generation farmer named Don Wiebe, whose family had been in Vermilion County since 1914, pulled into Marion's yard in his truck. Don was a straightforward man. He did not talk around things. "Marion," he said, "I hear you are not fallowing." "That is right." He looked at the field south of the yard, which was in its second year of a red clover and oat mix, standing green and thick in a county that was showing 3,000 acres of bare brown summer fallow in every direction. "What are you doing with it?" "Rolling it in this fall." Don was quiet for a moment. Don had farmed for 22 years. His father had farmed before him. His grandfather had come up from Minnesota in a wagon. In Don Wiebe's world, summer fallow was not a technique. It was a law of agriculture in northern Alberta, as settled and reliable as seeding in May and harvesting in August. You fallowed to control weeds. You fallowed to conserve moisture. You fallowed because the land needed to rest. Every agronomist, every extension officer, every generation of farmer who had come before him had told him this. "Marion," he said finally, "I have never heard of anybody doing that on purpose up here." "I know, Don. Mind if I ask why? I will show you the numbers when I have more of them." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is not convinced, but is not sure how to disagree, and drove back out the way he had come. By the time Don had reached the end of Marion's lane, Vermilion County had a new version of the story to tell. Here is what happened over the next 11 years. because this is the part that nobody except Walt Penner and Dr. Morrow in Guelph understood while it was happening. Marion's yields did not spike. That was the first thing. She had not promised anyone a miracle, but even she had expected some signal in the numbers, some clear vindication by the 4th or 5th year. What she got instead was stability. Her yields in bad years were better than her neighbors. Her yields in good years were roughly similar. Her input costs were falling because she was buying less commercial nitrogen. The clover and vetch were fixing it out of the air. But the real change was slower than that and harder to quantify, and she tracked it in 2 ways. In her soil laboratory reports and in what she could see with her own eyes walking the fields every spring. The soil reports were telling her something she had suspected since 1968. Her organic matter percentage was climbing, not fast. 0.5% in 4 years, then another 0.33% in the 3 years after that. Numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not read what she had read, and everything to someone who had. Organic matter is not soil fertility. It is soil capacity. It is the difference between land that can withstand a dry month and land that cannot, between land that drains properly in a wet spring and land that sits in puddles until June, between land that responds to inputs and land that has stopped responding because there is nothing alive in it to carry the response. What Marion could see with her eyes was simpler. Her soil was darker. It crumbled differently in her hand. It smelled different in April. A living smell. A smell that the bare fields down the road did not have. She knew she could not put that in a report. She wrote it in her notebook anyway, because her grandfather had started a soil notebook in 1908, and her father had continued it, and she had been adding to it since 1964, and she believed that what could not be measured could still be known. In 1976, she added a practice that raised eyebrows further. She began leaving the straw from her cereal crop standing, rather than incorporating it immediately. She started running a small cattle operation. 40 head of beef cows, purchased quietly from an estate sale near Lloydminster, the same way she purchased almost everything, without announcement and without asking anyone's opinion, and she began grazing the cattle on the standing straw residue in the fall after harvest. The cattle grazed. They deposited manure. The manure and the trampled straw went into the soil together under the winter snow, and what came out the other side in April was something different from what had gone in. Her neighbor Art Bergstrom came back to the yard that autumn. He stood at the fence and watched 40 beef cows moving across what had been a wheat field 2 months earlier. "Marion," he said, "now you are running cattle. Yes, on crop residue. Yes." He looked at the field. He looked at the cattle. He had the expression of a man watching something he does not have a category for. "What does your foreman think about all this?" Walt Penner was standing behind Marion. He had been working for the Drummond family for 23 years by then, long enough to have watched one generation hand the farm to the next, and long enough to have formed opinions he mostly kept to himself. "Walt," Marion said. Walt took off his cap. He looked at Art Bergstrom with the measured expression of a man who has been asked a question in public that he would rather answer in private. "I think," Walt said, "that the South Quarter looks better than it has in 20 years. And I have been looking at it for 20 years. Art Bergstrom drove home and told his wife that Marion Selkirk had lost her mind in a quiet and orderly fashion that was going to cost her the farm inside of 5 years. He was wrong. By 1979, the evidence was impossible to ignore if you were paying the right kind of attention, and a few people in Vermilion County were beginning to pay it. Marion's input costs per acre had dropped by nearly 30% compared to 1969. She was buying almost no commercial nitrogen. She was spending more on labor and fuel for the cover crop operations, but less on everything else, and the net number was moving in the right direction. Her yields were not spectacular. They were consistent in a business where consistency is everything, and spectacle is dangerous. Consistency was worth more than most people admitted. Don Wiebe was one of the first to notice. He had been watching Marion's fields from the road for 6 years, the way farmers watch each other's fields in a county where proximity and competition create a kind of involuntary surveillance that nobody quite acknowledges. He had seen the south quarter come off in the fall and look different from every other field on secondary Highway 41. Not greener, different, darker, more alive in a way he could not have explained to his banker. In the spring of 1979, Don seeded red clover into his barley on the north quarter. He did not tell anyone. He told his wife he was trying something. He told Walt Penner, over coffee in Marion's kitchen, that he had been watching for 6 years and he was ready to try one field. "One field is how it starts," Walt said. Marion did not look up from her notebook. "Let me tell you about the summer of 1984, because this is where 16 years of quiet work met a test nobody in northern Alberta was prepared for. The spring of 1984 was wet, too wet. Seeding ran 3 weeks behind across most of Peace River and Vermilion Country. The crops went in late and thin, and by mid-June, the agronomists at the Extension office were already adjusting their yield forecasts downward. Then the summer turned dry and hot and persistent. Not the catastrophic headline-making drought of the prairies in the 1930s, but the grinding, incremental drought that punishes farmers who entered the year with depleted soil and rewards, quietly and without fanfare, the ones who did not. And it was a local drought. Vermilion County and the surrounding municipalities. A long, dry August on top of a late, wet spring, on top of 6 years of below-average rainfall that had been eating into the subsoil moisture reserves of every farm in the region. The kind of drought that does not make the national news but bankrupts families and empties farmsteads. The grain prices were already bad. They had been bad since 1981. The combination of low prices and a failed crop was the equation that ended generational farms. Elevators in Vermilion were seeing below-average grades. Farmers who had borrowed against expected yield were calling their bank managers. The co-op was fielding questions about input deferrals. By early September, Vermilion County had the look of a community bracing for something it had seen before and was hoping not to see again. Marion Selkirk harvested her fields in the 3rd week of August. Her wheat on the south quarter graded number 2. Her barley on the north field was not spectacular, but it was sound. Her total yield across the farm was down from her best years. It was not down from her average years. In a county where most operations were reporting 30 to 40% reductions, Marion's numbers came in at roughly 12% below her 5-year average. She did not tell anyone the numbers. She did not have to. The elevators knew what came off her land. The grain buyers knew. Walt Penner knew. And Walt Penner was not a man who gossiped, but he was a man who had a coffee at the Vermilion Hotel on Thursday mornings. And there are things you do not need to say at a coffee table when you are the foreman of the one operation in the county that did not have a bad year. Don Wiebe had been running cover crops on 2 of his 5 quarters since 1979. Those 2 quarters came in 7% below average. His 3 continuous cereal quarters came in 34% below. Don was at the hotel on a Thursday in late September when a farmer named Lloyd, whose family had been on the same quarter section since 1921, said aloud what several men at the table had been circling for an hour. Marion Selkirk's land held. Nobody argued with that. What? There was a silence of the kind that happens when a room full of people who have been laughing at the same joke for 11 years realize simultaneously that they were the punchline. Walt Penner was at the table. He was 64 years old that year. He had been farming in Vermilion County since he was 19. First for his own father, then for Marion's father, Robert, then for Marion herself. He had argued against the cover crops in 1964, quietly, because Walt Penner argued against things quietly and then stopped arguing when the evidence told him to. He had stopped arguing against the cover crops in 1967. He had become, by 1975, one of the few people in Vermilion County who could have a conversation about nitrogen fixation without having to fake knowing what that meant. He did not say anything at the hotel that Thursday. He finished his coffee. He put on his cap. At the door he stopped, and a man named Ray, who had been farming the section north of Marion's place for 30 years, asked him what Marion was going to do with the windfall. Walt turned around. "It is not a windfall," Walt said. "It is the same land she has been building since 1964. It looks like a windfall from the outside, because nobody was watching her build it." He left. The door closed behind him. The coffee table was quiet for a longer time than usual. Marion had driven down to Guelph in October of 1983 to meet Dr. Sylvia Morrow for the first time, 18 years after their first letter. Dr. Morrow was 61, recently retired from the University of Guelph, and she had spent her career doing the kind of soil biology research that did not receive funding because it did not produce products that could be sold. She had published 41 papers. She was known in a narrow circle and unknown outside it. She had corresponded with Marion Selkirk for 18 years because Marion was the only farmer she had ever encountered who asked the questions she considered worth asking, and who had the patience to pursue the answers over a timescale that actual soil biology required. They had lunch in Dr. Morrow's kitchen. They talked for 6 hours. Dr. Morrow showed Marion the soil core samples she had been keeping from her own experimental plots since 1959. Marion showed Dr. Morrow the laboratory reports she had been accumulating since 1966. They compared notes the way scientists compared notes when they have been working on the same problem from different ends for a long time. And there is something clarifying about that kind of conversation, something that does not come from any amount of reading alone. "What?" Dr. Morrow said before Marion drove back to the airport, "was this. You have been doing in practice what we have been trying to demonstrate in controlled conditions for 20 years. The difference is that your data is real. It is from real land under real conditions over a real span of time. That is worth more than anything I published." Marion drove to the airport and flew home to Edmonton and drove back to Vermilion on the secondary highway, past the bare brown fields of her neighbors, thinking about what the word patience meant when applied to dirt. The Vermilion Standard ran a story in November of 1984 about the farms that had maintained production through the drought year. Marion was one of 4 operators the reporter interviewed. The other 3 had large hay reserves or irrigation infrastructure. Marion had neither. What she had was 20 years of cover cropping, cattle integration, and a refusal to fallow on land that her neighbors had been fallowing since before she was born. The reporter asked Marion how she had held her yields. Marion said she had read some papers from Guelph in the mid-1960s and had been trying to figure out if they applied to Peace River clay ever since. Then she asked the reporter if he wanted to see the soil records. He did not have time, he said. He had another interview in Kitscotty. Marion drove him out the lane and came back into the kitchen. and poured Walt a coffee, and they sat for a while, without talking, the way people sit when they are comfortable with silence, and there is nothing useful that words would add. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Robert Drummond, if he had lived to see it, would have understood without needing it explained. Marion ran the farm until 2001. She was 70 years old. Her younger daughter, a woman named Catherine, who had grown up between the fields and the soil notebooks and the letters from Guelph, had come back to the farm after 15 years in Winnipeg working as a hydrologist for the provincial government, and had been farming alongside Marion since 1995. Catherine had grown up watching her mother pull soil samples and write letters and roll cover crops into fields that her classmates' fathers were leaving bare. And she had not always understood what she was watching, but she had never stopped watching. Marion handed her the operation in the spring of 2001. She handed her 480 acres, a small beef herd, a cover crop rotation that had been refined over 37 years, and 42 filing cabinets of soil records, weather logs, and correspondence with Dr. Sylvia Morrow, who had died in 1999 at the age of 77, having seen, in her last years, the phrase regenerative agriculture begin to appear in the journals that had once declined to publish her work. Catherine runs the farm today. The cover crop rotation is still there. The cattle are still there. The soil notebooks that Marion's grandfather started in 1908 are in their 117th year. Catherine added her first entry on the 1st of April, 2001. A cold spring, late but not as late as some. The South Quarter soil in 2004, the last year, Marion personally pulled samples from every field, tested at 5.8% organic matter. When Marion had pulled her first samples from that field in 1966, it had tested at 2.1%. That is not a statistic. That is a generation of patience expressed in numbers. In 2006, the Alberta Soil Conservation Network invited Marion to speak at their annual meeting in Edmonton. She was 75 years old, retired, and had given exactly 0 public speeches in her life. She almost declined. Catherine told her she should go. Walt Penner, who was 86 and still came by the farm twice a week, for no reason that was ever articulated, told her the same thing. Marion stood at the podium with 3 index cards. She looked at them once, put them in her jacket pocket, and spoke without them. People have been asking me for 20 years why I stopped fallowing when every agronomist in Alberta said to fallow. That is not quite the right question. The right question is why we started fallowing in the first place, and whether the reasons still hold. She paused. We started fallowing in the 1920s because it killed weeds and it conserved moisture. Those were real problems, and they were real solutions. But we were also, every time we left a field, bare for a season, losing organic matter, losing biological activity, losing the slow, patient capacity of the soil to look after itself through a bad year. We were mining something we did not know. We were mining, and the bill bigim can the bill Q. Every drought year, and every drought year we looked at the sky and called it weather, and did not look at the ground and call it management. She paused again. In 1984, my neighbors lost 30 and 40% of their yield. My farm lost 12, not because my land is better. My land is the same Peace River clay as every farm on Secondary 41. I had 20 years of cover crops and cattle manure and standing residue, and no fallow to thank for the difference. 20 years of feeding the ground, instead of asking the ground to feed me on credit it did not have. That is not a secret. It is not even new. Scottish crofters were doing it in 1700. The French were doing it before that. We decided somewhere around 1920 that you could simplify the system down to grain and fallow and nothing else, and we forgot that we decided it. And then we started teaching it as though it were a natural law. It is not a natural law. It is a shortcut. And like most shortcuts, it saved time at the front and cost more at the back. She looked out at the room. In 1984, when the ground was dry and the grain was thin, and my neighbors were calling their banks, my fields held. Not because I am smarter than anyone in Vermilion County, because I had been reading letters from a woman in Guelph since 1965, and she was smarter than both of us put together, and nobody gave her a cent to prove what she already knew. She stepped down. The room was quiet, and then it was not. Don Wiebe was in the audience. He was 70 years old, still farming, and he had been running cover crops on all 5 of his quarters since 1985. He had come through the 1984 drought on his cover crop land at 8% below average, and on his remaining continuous cereal land at 31% below. And the following spring, he had put every field he owned into a rotation that Marion Selkirk would have recognized. After the speech, Don found Marion in the lobby of the Westin. 20 years, he said. 20 years. I drove past your south quarter for 6 years before I came into your yard. I know. Marion smiled. I saw your truck. You already knew what you were doing in 1969. I knew what I was trying. The ground took a while to confirm it. Don nodded. He looked at his hands, the way farmers look at their hands when they are thinking about things that hands have done. What did you see, he said, when you walked your fields in August of 1984? When everything around you was going thin, Marion thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about things, carefully and without rushing to the answer. I saw what the ground had been building, she said. When you feed soil for 20 years, it builds a kind of memory. It remembers wet years and dry years, and it holds something back for the hard times. I was not clever enough to plan for 1984 specifically. I just kept feeding the ground what it needed, and it knew what to do with a dry August better than I did. Don was quiet. My father would have understood that, Marion said, not the soil biology. He did not know about mycorrhizal networks or nitrogen fixation. But he knew the ground was telling him something, and he believed listening to it was more important than arguing with it. That is what he taught me. They stood in the lobby for a while. Outside, Edmonton was dark and cold, and the November streets were empty. What do you see? Don said finally. When you walk a field in May that other people see as a weed problem or a fallow year. Marion looked at him. Most people see a management failure. A field that needs fixing, something to spray or till or leave bare until it behaves itself. She paused. I see 16 species of plants, half of them fixing nitrogen, a third of them building root structure 6 feet down, all of them feeding something in the soil I will never be able to count or weigh or photograph. I see 20 years of feeding the ground without asking for a receipt. Don laughed. I see the same thing now. You did not see it in 1973, Marion said. I did not see it in 1973, but I watched you for 6 years, and by 1979 I had seen enough. That is how it happens, Marion said. One field at a time. One drought at a time, one neighbor watching another neighbor's ground and asking themselves why it looks different. They said, nobody stopped fallowing in Vermilion County. Marion Selkirk stopped fallowing, and when the summer of 1984 came in dry and late and unforgiving, the way a true test always comes when no one is ready for it. The county understood something it had not been willing to learn when she first tried to explain it. A field is not a machine. It is not a bank account you draw on every fall and replenish every spring with inputs purchased on credit. It is a living system with a memory longer than yours, and if you feed it long enough, and listen to it carefully enough, and resist the very human urge to simplify it past the point it can function, it will hold in years that break everything around it. One woman, 37 years. A bag of red clover seed, left in a bin room by her father, and the patience to learn what it meant.